Today, the history of the papacy is brought to you in part by Sudio Premium Headphones and Earbuds. Sudio offers 5 distinct and high-quality styles. Each has incredibly long battery life, which is really key when you're outside all day doing hard work and your Bluetooth earbuds die. Doesn't it always happen right in the middle of the best part of the show? Ridiculous. You shouldn't have to go through that. The same thing if you're listening on a long commute. It's just barbaric. These headphones and earbuds have excellent audio quality with sleek and sophisticated Scandinavian design as well. But, at least with the headphones, you don't have to follow a long set of directions to put them together. All you have to do to start listening to all your favorite podcasts and music on your new Sudio Headphones is to go to their website, studiosweden.com, and enter discount code POPE at checkout to receive a 15% discount and free worldwide shipping. That's a 15% discount and shipping to anywhere in the world for free. Again, go over to studiosweden.com and enter the discount code POPE. Enjoy your next episode of the History of the Papacy and Beyond the Big Screen with your new pair of Sudio headphones. More information can also be found in the show notes. Sidetrack episode 58, Dear Johann. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. Go over to agorapodcastnetwork.com to find more great, thought-provoking, and independent podcasts. You can learn more about the history of the papacy at a2zhistorypage.com. You can connect and like all the social media from there and link to Apple Podcasts, where you can leave a rating and review. I would love to give a huge shout out to our latest and newest patrons on patreon.com/papacy, Travis Dow and Laura. Travis obviously needs no introduction here. He is a podcaster extraordinaire and friend of the show. Look for a collaboration with Travis in your feeds very soon. In fact, quite a few collaborations. Thank you so much, Laura and Travis. I really appreciate it. Also, before we dive into the episode, I'd like to introduce the Agora Podcaster of the Month and newest member of the Agora Podcast Network, The History of Westeros. Now, I'm very new to the whole Game of Thrones and Song of Fire and Ice books and know very little about the books or the television drama. I should probably be very ashamed of that fact, but what I do know for a fact is that The History of Westeros is an incredibly well done and highly researched podcast. It is also incredibly entertaining. If you love the TV series and the books, you should definitely be listening to The History of Westeros. Today we have a short episode to discuss 2 characters who are generally reviled by the Protestant reformers. They basically fill in the role of antagonists in the story elements chart of the Protestant Reformation. In this episode, you actually get 2 Johanns for the price of 1. Today the topic of the show is Johann von Eck and Johann Tetzel. Both can alternatively be anglicized as John Eck and John Tetzel. I'll probably use John for the most part, but forgive me if I revert back and forth between John and Johann. We'll treat John Tetzel first, since he's probably the more known of the 2 Johns. Then we'll talk about John of Eck. Tetzel was about 20 years older than Luther, but in many ways followed a similar career trajectory as Luther. Tetzel was a member of the Dominican order, which may have been one of the reasons Luther would clash with him, a little interleague rivalry, if you will. Luther rose up the academic ranks a bit quicker than Tetzel, but Tetzel did in fact earn a doctorate degree in theology. As Ben Jacobs said in the Martin Luther at the Movies episode on Beyond the Big Screen, you have to keep in mind doctorate meant something similar, but also something very different from our modern idea of doctorate. Martin Luther's career more closely fits our modern idea of an academic, but Tetzel was more typical of someone who attained high levels of education of his day. Tetzel studied, worked, and then stood for advanced degrees at various universities, including at Leipzig. All throughout this time, Tetzel moved up the ranks of the church and the Dominican hierarchy. He became the top-ranking Dominican in Poland, and he later became Inquisitor of Poland. Tetzel operated in the periphery of Luther's zone of influence, to the south and east of where Luther lived and worked. Luther, and especially his later apologists, really needed a major antagonist to set Luther against. They were creating a narrative, so why not paint this Tetzel character as virtually the devil incarnate, the person who was pimping the whore of Babylon, namely the Pope, in the lands of central Germany. Luther is the rational, educated one who will wipe the slate clean of all the non-biblical nonsense the popes have added to the church, things like indulgences. So Tetzel gets molded into this role of traveling snake oil salesman, hawking the Pope's crummy indulgences with the righteous, educated, enlightened Luther standing up against it all. There is a solid nugget of truth to this narrative. There were abuses in the indulgences scheme. In fact, Tetzel was even responsible for some of these abuses. But Tetzel's abuses were of a theological, not financial nature. There were a few accusations against Tetzel. For one, he was accused of being basically a salesman with a strict quota. Tetzel was also accused of skimming from the take, if you will. Both accounts are almost certainly not true. We're talking about really big-time Renaissance finance here. There were checks and double checks and triple checks to make sure the take was accurate. Where Tetzel followed up was how he induced people to procure indulgences and some of the language he used to preach indulgences. One such saying, which may or may not have been said by Tetzel, was, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." That was not good, and definitely suggests a pay-for-play element to indulgences. Even if Tetzel didn't say that one directly, he did have a very questionable theology on purgatory and indulgences that had a following among a minority of theologians, but was not an official church position. Tetzel was also called out for these positions he took on indulgences by the famous Cardinal Cajetan, whose Italian name, Tommaso Gaetani, was Germanized to Cajetan. Luther's 95 Theses were initially meant to be a call to debate, and the debate was being had in academic circles. Tetzel even responded with his own set of theses, so a lot of theses being thrown around. Cardinal Gaetani, or Cajetan, was as well educated as Luther and arguably better educated. This was an academic, inside baseball argument that got blown up all beyond recognition by political forces, big changes in technology, and cultural forces. The person and reputation of John Tetzel was also blown up beyond recognition too. Even at Tetzel's death, Luther didn't have any personal animosity towards him. At this earliest point in the Reformation, we're still looking at an academic debate among German theologians. I'd also add a little piece in here that Luther may have been just a little bit angry at Tetzel on a personal level because what Tetzel was preaching was widely popular in Luther's area, and people would leave Luther's area to go to where Tetzel was preaching to hear him and get or procure those indulgences. So just another thing to think about in what was going on at that time. Now for our second Johann of the day, and one of the classic antagonists of Martin Luther, who has been made into a two-dimensional character, but who was really much more interesting than the polemicists' arguments, Johann von Eck. In film and in the standard narrative, Johann Eck is the attack dog of the Pope and Emperor. He uses legalistic arguments and trickery and tries to beat Martin Luther into submission with fancy arguments and good old-fashioned book learning. Poor Martin's the humble servant of God who just wants to use the Bible alone to defend his humble faith. This is the reverse coin of Martin Luther, of course. Against Johann Tetzel, Martin Luther is the doctor of theology who uses his vast knowledge and intellect to defeat the used car salesman Tetzel. Now Luther is the simple Christian man, full of humility, who just wants to do right by God, and he's getting attacked by the unscrupulous prosecutor and persecutor hired by the dreaded Pope and Holy Roman Emperor. Again, this whole story is really a creation of the polemics between Catholics and Protestants and within Protestantism in the years after all of these guys were long dead and buried. They were all real people: Luther, Melanchthon, Eck, Tetzel, Leo X, and all of the above. There's just so many more interesting aspects to their characters and personalities. John von Eck, or Johann von Eck, and the Catholic opposition to Luther are oftentimes almost portrayed as superstitious, uneducated, and terrified of change. The real John von Eck blows every single one of these ideas straight out of the water. By the standards of the day, it is very easy to argue that John von Eck was better educated than Martin Luther himself. Eck was definitely more widely educated. He studied many more subjects, and he also obtained his doctorates at more acclaimed universities than Luther. Eck gave very eloquent and well-thought-out arguments to counter Luther's concerns with the Catholic Church and its theological positions. Eck was also much more plugged into the Catholic hierarchy and the concerns and needs of the Roman Church than Luther would be. Now, on the other counts that people like Eck were superstitious and frightened of change Luther brought, let's look at that one. Eck was very forward-thinking on many respects. Now, unfortunately, one respect where Eck was definitely not forward-thinking was on relations with the Jews. He definitely held views that we today would hold as anti-Semitic and abhorrent. He engaged in many polemics against the Jews. Unfortunately as well, these views put him into the mainstream of German theologians. In other areas, Eck was quite forward-thinking, though. Eck was a scholastic and a humanist, as were many of the leading scholars of the day. He was also plugged into the wealthy banking concerns of southern Germany, particularly the Fugger family. The Fugger banking family was a very big deal in the late Middle Ages, early modern period. They actually took over a bunch of assets and business concerns from the Medici Bank. One of the leaders of the family was this guy named Jacob Fugger, the Rich. I think the title, or the sobriquet, the Rich, just about says it all that you need to know about Jacob or Jacob. Like, who else gets the nickname, the Rich? Well, you can't say much else about the guy, but whew, man, he's rich. I'm also waiting for a television drama starring Richard Madden as Jacob the Rich. Now, what the heck does Eck have to do with Fugger and high finance of the Middle Ages and early modern period? Well, as we know, the church had a big problem with usury, or the lending of money at interest. A lot of religions have a problem with this. Islam has a lot of really interesting financial instruments to work around interest to this day. I think I kind of sense a off-track episode forming up here. Look out for that, for an off-track episode on this at some point in the future. The early capitalists of the 14 and 1500s also developed sophisticated tools to work around their own prohibition against usury. They couldn't straight up charge a set interest rate for a loan because that would be usury, of course. But they did have some tools to circumvent usury. Money is a commodity like many others. If you send money out there, one expects some sort of remuneration for the use of that money. It is the thing that makes economies work and grow. One tool was the triple contract. Johann Eck was a big proponent of the triple contract, and he was also a big booster of early capitalism. Martin Luther was definitely not a proponent of any of the above. Martin Luther despised profit-making enterprises, especially the charging of time for money, basically interest. Marty, though, he walked that fine line because he also developed a really big problem with asceticism in the monastic sense. Eck had no issue with either monasticism or early capitalism. The triple contract was a bundle of agreements that included insurance and premiums to be paid out over time. All of this was meant to skirt around usury. Was much of these contracts usury in disguise? I'm no medieval contracts or economics specialist, but it sure does seem that way to me. The triple contract propped the door open for more open and obvious interest-bearing transactions, which was a clear path to the road to modern capitalism. One of the standard takeaways of the Protestant Reformation is that it set the stage for modern capitalism, but as we can see, and what we have seen from previous discussions, is that the Catholic and Mediterranean world provided many of the tools and paved the road for a great deal of what would become modern-day finance. One other conception we get is that the Catholic scholars just dug in their heels and would not compromise or even talk with the reformers. This is another misnomer. John Eck actually worked during his whole life to make peace and some sort of compromise with the reformers. He worked especially hard with the Calvinist reformers in Switzerland like Zwingli. The Swiss Calvinist reformers sort of get swept up in the whole Protestant Reformation talk, but they were quite distinct from the Lutheran reformers and were in just as heated disagreement with Luther as they were with the Catholic Church, and the same thing with Luther with the Swiss reformers. It was just all a mess. Eck's rapprochements weren't very successful with the Calvinist Swiss reformers or the Lutheran reformers, but he did make a go of it. The two Johns of this episode, John Tetzel and John Eck, were complicated and compelling figures. There's just so much to them, and a short sidetrack doesn't really do them justice. But we can use this as a jumping-off point for a bigger discussion of the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. So much blood was spilled shortly after these men left the stage. But was it necessary? In the next episode, we will discuss how all of this is seen through a modern lens. After that, we will go all the way back to pick up on our adventures in the 500s AD with more schism and political upheaval. No matter where we stop our time machine in history, the themes seem to be the same. I look forward to learning more, and I hope you'll join me. A huge shout out goes to our Rome level patrons, Peter the Great and Mary. Our Constantinople level patrons on patreon.com/papacy. We have Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, and Yoren, as well as our Alexandria level patrons, Francine and Richard. Speaking of Patreon, one of the new benefits of joining patreon.com/papacy at any level is access to a new series of bonus content called Off-Track Episodes, which I did mention earlier in the episode. And these episodes are just little tidbits of information I've picked up along the way that they don't fit into either a main episode or even a sidetrack episode, but they're still really fun and interesting, and something I like to talk about and share with you. So now you have even more great reasons to join the crew on Patreon. Of course, I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I, as always, look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.